it sort of provokes this question of like, why are we here in the crypto space? Are we here just to build bigger money Ponzi's and money casinos? Or are we here because we're trying to build a financial system that optimizes for human thriving, not just survival, not just like resource allocation, but how do we build for human thriving?
What is up, everyone, and welcome to Money Legos, a podcast about global economic freedom and the builders making it a reality. I'm Greg Brainerd, and I'm excited to bring you the very first episode of the show. Today, we have a conversation with Kevin Owocki that was originally conducted as a live stream on May 12th, 2022. Kevin is a founder, author, software developer, podcast host, thought leader, builder, and Colorodian. He is the founder of Gitcoin, a project that helps crowdfund public goods and software development on different blockchain ecosystems, including Ethereum and Polgyon. Gitcoin has facilitated over $60 million in funding for public goods, including household name projects like Uniswap, ENS, and many more. Without further ado, let's jump into this fascinating conversation with Kevin Owocki.
Kevin, I think you're going to walk us through the Gitcoin project, but maybe first a question to kick us off. So a big part of Gitcoin's mission is funding open source software. How long have you been working with open source software, and what brought you to start Gitcoin?
So I have a computer science degree and have basically been building software systems for the last 15 or 20 years. I went through Techstars in 2008 as a pre-seed stage CTO and built an online dating website that grew to 3 million users. And after that imploded, or I guess I'm supposed to say we got acquired, we got acqui-hired. I was just a CTO of VP engineering in the Web2 movement. Basically worked for other Techstars companies for the next 10 years. And I hired 45 software engineers during that time for teams that I ran. And I got really good at recruiting software engineers. And I realized that, oh my gosh, you don't have to pay a recruiter $30,000 per head to like place engineers on your team. So like, that was like, you know, like that scene in like The Matrix when Neo realizes that it's all like code around him. Like me realizing that I could recruit software engineers without having to go through a recruiter was like that moment for me. And then the other sort of like moment for me that from that time was how much I built and relied on open source software. Open source creates $400 billion per year in economic value, but since the code is available for free, there's no real great way to monetize it. And this means that people don't work on open source software other than like nights and weekends. And I think it's systemically unfair for these people to have to work away from their families. And, so I mean, I like, the fact that when I was a VP engineering, we would use Nginx and not build our own web server, Postgres and not build our own database server, Ubuntu not build our own operating system, meant that we were standing on the shoulders of giants. So it was the two threads of disintermediating recruiters and trying to support open source software that Gitcoin was born out of. And so Gitcoin is just a place that you can get coins if you're working on open source software. And the insight is that there's $2 trillion worth of capital floating around the open source financial system, or at least there was $2 trillion when I wrote this talk. It's probably like $1 trillion now. And we just want to be the rails through which that capital finds developers and developers find that capital, or one of the rails. So yeah, that's kind of the history and the genesis of Gitcoin.
I think Gitcoin is really a project that is implementing a lot of the philosophy behind kind of accessible financial markets and global financial markets, which is a lot of the promise of kind of cryptocurrency in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like open source sustainability is a coordination failure, right? Like everyone wants to rely on open source software, but no one wants to pay for it. And I think that blockchains are this ultimate coordination substrate for the world. They're transparent, immutable, programmable, and global financial system. So it's a coordination substrate for humanity. And I think we can use it to solve some coordination failures. And I hope that us focusing on open source means that we can actually create an impact on open source sustainability. But we're kind of lucky that Gitcoin just kind of fell ass backwards into a market of people who understand MetaMask and private keys and how to use crypto. So we can actually build stuff now that other people, because of onboarding challenges, can't, because our audience is software engineers. But imagine if we can solve a public goods problem in open source sustainability, how we can export that to other coordination failures in the world, things like climate change or like funding journalism or any other public good out there. So that's I think like the long-term upside for using blockchain for coordination failure solving instead of just like speculation and finance.
Well, it'd be great to walk us through sort of Gitcoin and its mission and get our audience more acquainted with the project, if that sounds good.
Okay, cool. So this is Gitcoin.co. This is the primary application that I work on. It's basically, I think I'll start with our mission. So the mission of Gitcoin is to build and fund digital public goods. We basically want to empower builders to connect with each other and to create the future of the open web. Basically, get coins for working on open source software and crypto. So I think that we're really focused on the Internet of Jobs. Basically, what does it look like for a software engineer to quit their corporate job and work for the open internet? So the unbundled things that you can focus on, I think that are like under the umbrella of what a job is earning. So getting coins for working on open source software, learning. So basically building blockchain knowledge as you go, connecting, meeting other developers in the space, building relationships. And I mean, both connecting in the we're going to a networking happy hour and we're going to exchange business cards way, but also in like a deep communing with the purpose that we're here and the reason that we're in the blockchain space, deeply communing with people and building great friendships. I mean, in that sense also. And then of course, funding open source software and attracting developers to your project. So the world that we want to create is basically a world where people can quit their job and work for the open internet, work on open source software. And we envision an open economy of people who are building in public, working on DeFi, NFT projects, working on open source software in general, and able to pay their mortgage in with the work that they're doing on open source software. So over time, we've kind of evolved a lot over time as we've tried to figure out exactly what the best way to empower these communities to build and fund for their shared needs are. We launched in 2017 rather naively thinking that bounties was going to be a mechanism to support open source software. And it is sort of like bounties are kind of like, if you do X, I will give you Y coins. And we've done a couple $1 million worth of bounties on the platform. They're good for kind of like interview style tasks. Oh, we get to work on something together in open source, like an actual problem that we have, as opposed to whenever I was a coder and we had to do like some whiteboard exercise that was some contrived thing, like balance a hash tree or something like that. I always felt like those were so contrived and so different from what we were actually doing in our day jobs. And the nice thing about bounties is, like, instead of talking about what it would be like to approximate what it's like to work together, you can actually just work on an open source software problem together, and the interviewee or the worker can get paid for their time. So our mission has always been to build and fund public goods, help communities meet their shared needs, but our way of doing it over time has evolved a lot. We launched a bunch of different stuff in the last cycle. I'd say the most successful of them were hackathons, which are just basically a event that we do with some of the top sponsors in Web3, Protocol Labs, Akash Network, Uniswap. We'll basically put up a bunch of prizes for hackers to work on basically work on coding or design tasks with them. And then we'll send between 200 and 1,000 hackers into these ecosystems and have them kick the tire on your API, which is a really great way to get to know a lot of software developers and build an ecosystem. In 2019, we launched Gitcoin Grants, which I would say is our flagship product and is the way that most of the, I'd say it's the most successful product that Gitcoin has ever launched. If you go to gitcoin.co/results, you can see our history of how much open source software we funded. And we just crossed $60 million worth of funding for open source software. As you can see from the graph, most of it is grants right here. So just super proud that we've got one of the #1 crowdfunding platforms in the Ethereum ecosystem. And Gitcoin Grants is our flagship product. It relies on something called quadratic funding, which I can go into if you're interested. And then the last project that I want to talk about is Kernel, which is basically a Web3 educational community. Basically, we take 200 of the top hackers in the Gitcoin community and in the Web3 community at a time and put them through an 8-week onboarding process, which we teach them about the values of Web3, what they're going to need to know in order to be successful in Web3. And at the end of that, they can pitch a bunch of different companies for, sorry, not companies, like funders for funding for their projects. So it's kind of like an accelerator somewhere between an on-deck fellowship and the Web3 native university. And Kernel is like the educational component of the Gitcoin community. So yeah, grants, Kernel, and hackathons are
Yeah,
major products.
the kernel is great. How do people get involved there, and what sort of applicants are you looking for?
Yeah, so if you go to kernel.community and you click on apply, you can apply for what's called a kernel block. And those are just basically cohorts of hackers. We're just basically looking for people who are sincerely looking to enter Web3, have a few hours per week to participate in kernel firesides, kernel educational community, and are looking to get full-time into the Web3 space. So designers, developers, writers, basically entrepreneurs, anyone who's interested in participating in the Web3 economy can apply.
That's great. And we're we're getting a few questions from the audience that people would love an overview of quadratic funding.
Yeah,
so if
totally.
you wouldn't mind spending a couple minutes on that, it is a really interesting mechanism.
Definitely. So we built this website called WTFisQF.com, which its objective is to explain quadratic funding to people. And the reason why we built this website was that Glenn and Vitalik and Zoe, the inventors of quadratic funding, wrote this paper about it. And the paper is like 31 pages long. So we realized that no one was going to read the paper, or at least less people would read the paper than if we made it into a shiny neon website. So that's the genesis of this website, WTFisQF.com, that we're looking at right here. Basically what quadratic funding is every quarter on Gitcoin, we run a matching campaign where we have $3 million worth of matching funds. Well, the last matching campaign was $3 million, but this most recent one may be less given that the market has become a little bit more volatile. And basically the way quadratic funding works is that we, for 2 weeks out of the quarter, will match contributions to different grants on gitcoin.co/grants. And the way quadratic funding works is that if two projects raise the same amount of money, but project one raises from way more money, or sorry, from way more contributors than from project two, then project one will get way more of the matching funds. And what's powerful about that is that if you're showing up to fund a project and you're only willing to spend $1 or $2, you can actually get a whole ton of matching that comes along with your contribution. And what's really cool about that is that, I mean, like during grants round 12, there was a grant that if you gave $1, the project got $1,000, which to me is just incredible, because it means that if you show up with $1, you can really make a difference at the individual level. And it gets people over that free rider problem of, oh, I'm already getting this open source for free. Why should I even bother to pay for it? And so getting over the free rider problem is one of the most important things quadratic funding can do. But I think that one of the coolest things is that because the number of contributors matters more than the amount funded, this pushes power to the edges away from whales and other central power brokers in an ecosystem, which creates more democracy in public goods funding decisions. It's just like, that's the end game there, is basically to create more democracy in how public goods are funded. And also this is a more scalable way of building your ecosystem than hiring a grants round that's going to review, hiring a grants team that's going to review a bunch of grant applications. Like you can do 1,000 projects per quarter on Gitcoin grants, whereas with a central grants team, you can maybe evaluate like 50 to 100 grant applications. And the coolest thing I think is, let me look for it, but Gitcoin grants is actually this preference signaling mechanism where, so if you take a look at this graph that we published to Twitter, each node in this network is a grant or a user, and each edge is a funding transaction between the two. So we build this dense preference map of what the everyday people in your ecosystem actually care about, and then drop money to those projects. And so this is a grants round 13 preference map And the economic graph was so dense because we had 700,000 transactions that this 3D map was crashing my browser. So every edge in this graph is actually 1,000 transactions as opposed to one transaction. So a deep preference map of what people in your community care about. And that's kind of the magic of quadratic funding. Quadratic funding does have an Achilles heel, though, which is this thing called Sybil attacks. So basically, if you know how to manufacture a fake identity, then you can take that second grant in my example, and you could just manufacture identities and get more of the matching funds by doing that. And so we've been putting a lot of research and development efforts into figuring out how do we identify a unique contributor and making sure that the Gitcoin grant system is what's called Sybil resistant, which just basically means that it's resistant to sock puppet accounts. So whenever I present about quadratic funding, I try to be honest about where it's powerful and where it's weak. It's powerful because it pushes power to the edges, and it's weak if you can Sybil attack it. So that's kind of like the long and short on quadratic funding. Would be happy to take more questions about that. It's honestly like quadratic funding is the mechanism that Gitcoin is sort of built upon. It's kind of like our flagship. So I'm deeply proud of our work putting quadratic funding into practice, but it's still something that's evolving forward and is not nearly complete. But that's where I spend a lot of our research efforts, is trying to evolve quadratic funding forward.
Yeah, it's such an interesting mechanism too, because it really makes every vote count in a way that other mechanisms don't. So if you want to vote or want to give back to a project, but you only have $1, if there's not some sort of quadratic kind of matching algorithm, then you probably just won't give that $1 because $1 doesn't really do anything. But with this mechanism, you're incentivized to give that $1 because if you and 100 or 1,000 other people give that $1, then it'll cast more votes for the public good that you're trying to fund, or the open source software, or the podcast, or the multiple different types of things that get funded on Gitcoin's platform.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's about, we want to measure the preferences of like the everyday participants, not just what the rich people want. And a lot of these crypto ecosystems are subject to this thing called the Matthew effect, which is basically the rich get richer. It's the compounding wealth that comes with accumulated capital. So like the rich get richer, or the famous get more famous. And it's like a fundamental law of a lot of these economic systems. And quadratic funding is designed to counteract the Matthew effect, which I think is really interesting when you're trying to build a web that works for everyday participants instead of just the rich people.
I'd love to get into sort of the regen versus degen kind of differences in debate. With cryptocurrency and in Web3, if you like to use that sort of terminology, we have this kind of pretty radical philosophy of alternate financial ecosystems and alternate economies, and pushing power out to the edges and democratization, and having things be accessible, lowering those barriers to entry. But then, it'd be easy to say, if you're looking at crypto today, that it's just a bunch of really expensive gated metaverse lands and, $1 million JPEGs. And not that those things, I mean, not to really knock those things. I don't know if that's, they're sort of debatable kind of value, but what is sort of regenerative finance, and how does it contrast with maybe the degen trends that we're seeing kind of in crypto pop culture, if that's a thing?
Yeah, totally. Well, so it was the summer of 2020, and it was called DeFi summer. And I think that we had just gotten out of the long bear market in the crypto ecosystem, in which asset prices were super depressed. And there's this meme of degens. Degen was just basically anyone who was going around and chasing yield on all these yield farming things that were happening in the summer of 2020. And yield farming started with Compound, where you could like stake your DAI in CDAI and you could earn a couple percentage points of yield. But then what started happening is all these different esoteric assets like Yam Finance were allowing you to like stake your yams and earn like 10% or like 20% per week or something like that in these like crazy money games, these yield farming games. And degens was kind of a meme that came out of that. And you know, I'm still sitting over there building public goods as this is happening, you know, working on open source software. And so we started talking about what would regen finance look like, as opposed to degen, where you're just like kind of gambling and you're chasing the biggest yields in this giant casino. What does regen finance look like? And I think that it sort of provokes this question of like, why are we here in the crypto space? Are we here just to build bigger money Ponzi's and money casinos? Or are we here because we're trying to build a financial system that optimizes for human thriving, not just survival, not just like resource allocation, but how do we build for human thriving? And so that's like a design space that I would call regenerative crypto economics. How do we build positive sum games? How do we build resources that increase their capacity over time as opposed to deplete over time? And I think that, you know, there's a real question in my mind of, are the open source money games in the blockchain ecosystem the final destination of what we're building for? Or are they just the bootloader for something that's greater, something that's going to help us as a human species coordinate around our shared needs, solve things like climate change, solve things like the security of our digital infrastructure? Will capital be allocated to things that are not just chasing the shortest term yield, but actually our longest term problems? And there's a lot of design considerations in how you build a financial system that I think we just take for granted, because at least here in the United States, we have these quarterly profit cycles, and all of these like executives are on this tread where they're just chasing the next quarterly profit. What if we could optimize for, instead of just what's good for now me, we could optimize for a bento box of incentives, like what's good for now me, but also future me? What's good for now me, but also now us? And then the fourth quadrant of the bento box is future us. So basically, regen is this design space of how do we use the open source financial system to solve for our shared needs? And it's a very unsolved question. And the last thing I'll say about this is that I think that you can't have the regen without the degen, and you can't have the degen without the regen. And so I don't think it's useful to go into like a moral place with like degen versus regen. I'm not here to say that regen is better than degen. I think that, you know, the money that goes into these like investment in like DeFi helps create a bigger pie through which regenerative crypto economics can help solve the coordination problems in the world. And so they're like two sides of the same coin, and they both kind of need each other, I think. And so I don't when I talk about regen, it's not a moralizing thing. It's about like system design and how do we solve for our shared needs. So I did write a book about regenerative crypto economics, which you can get at greenpill.party. And maybe I'll generate a coupon code or something for this group so that you guys can pick it up cheap. But yeah, I'm curious if that brings up anything for you, Greg, about regenerative crypto economics.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, I'm sort of just learning about it, but I definitely like the catchy name and the contrast between kind of degen. It immediately sort of brings kind of imagery to your mind of a more inclusive economic system, which I think is why a lot of us are really in crypto, or at least it's the philosophy like behind crypto in general. And
yeah.
And I'd be curious to know, because it's really hard to put a finger on what it looks like, because it's such a developing kind of design space. A lot of ideas are currently being, you know, a lot of projects are currently being worked on. Mm-hmm. So I'd be curious to hear if you have any particular projects that you think are hitting the nail on the head or doing really interesting work.
So I've been working with a couple of different people on mapping out the regenerative crypto economic space, and we came up with this collateral about impact DAOs and how we categorize them. So basically, impact DAOs are any Web3 project that creates positive externalities, and we've divided them up in this infographic as tooling and infrastructure and applied research in the center. So basically, like the technology projects in the center that are regenerative are in the center. And then we've got educational regenerative projects. And then we've got basically DeSci, which is basically using crypto in order to fund science. We've got living capital projects. So refi, basically think projects that are aiming to solve for biodiversity loss and climate change, things that have to do with material capital. And then, so this is kind of like the taxonomy of how I view the actual impact ecosystem and how it's evolving. So if you pick up a copy of the Impact Owl book with that coupon code, you can get a copy of that poster. But to actually answer your question, I'm really excited about Proof of Humanity. Proof of Humanity is a civil resistance tool that is streaming money via UBI to everyone who is in the Proof of Humanity registry. And the Proof of Humanity tokens are worth $1,000 a month of UBI people are getting. So if you live in like Argentina or somewhere where that goes a long way, you can basically live off of UBI, which I think is deeply cool that this crypto economic system has been built on Proof of Humanity, and that people are actually living off of Proof of Humanity. That's a great example of a regenerative system.
And the point of regenerative finance, right? It's to align the incentives so that, exactly as you said, it's not just me now kind of short-term, reward degen activity. It's more about, me later, me in my future, and then also us, now and us in our future, changing the incentives so that, we're aligned sort of as a community rather than just me trying to generate 1,000% return on my tokens.
One of the things that I deeply believe is that above a certain amount of wealth, more wealth doesn't make you more happy. But below a certain amount of wealth, you can't meet your own needs, right? So I don't want to get caught in this like moralizing trap of like regen and degen and like yield chasing versus not. Under like 100K a year, I think the science says you're very focused on how do you meet your needs? How do you get housing and shelter? How do you get food? How do you support your loved ones around you? Under 100K per year. Above 100K per year, money doesn't make you more happy because you already have those basic needs met. So basically what I think is that if this open source financial system is going to create abundance in which people are making all of this money, what if we created more positive sum games for the people who already have their abundance needs met? And this is important to say because I'm very privileged. I mean, I grew up middle class in the United States. I'm a white guy. I have a computer science degree. There are just like opportunities that I have that 90% of humanity probably doesn't have. And I think recognizing my privilege, it means that you can't unilaterally say that just, focusing on your own profit is bad, because you have to be in that position of privilege of having that abundance in order to focus on regen. So my real target is the people who have made millions of dollars off of crypto. Hey, what if you gave back? What if you built your legacy by helping to help the world meet its shared needs? I think is the message for that audience. And if you're still like struggling to make it, still building a career, and you're barely making rent, then a lot of this stuff maybe the messaging is like, hey, you can come work on these regenerative crypto projects and make your living while making the world a better place. But I think it's really just important to recognize our privilege of being able to work on these things, because if you're living paycheck to paycheck, then you might not care as much about all this like philosophy about regenerating the world or whatever.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's so important to recognize kind of our privileged position, especially as it relates to these types of discussions. And I think something like 75% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Mm-hmm. Globally, I'm not sure what the stat is, but I'm sure it's, something similar or maybe even more. And so like one of the reasons I was in kind of crypto in general is, how can we use crypto to make a more sort of inclusive financial system that provides people with a basic level of wealth and income so that they can focus on these other things, and we can all, sort of kumbaya, make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. And so it's fascinating, this kind of concept of regenerative finance. Yeah. And it's a really interesting discussion.
I think one of the coolest things in the world is that, 20 years ago, you couldn't really design an economy unless you're on the Federal Reserve Board. And now, since we've got open source software and the proliferation of these money Legos, there are people who can walk into a hackathon in a weekend hackathon and they can build an economic system and they can actually put it out into the world and see if it works. And I think it's deeply cool that us everyday people can talk about how to design for these things, and we can think outside of the box of the financial system that we inherited by using, not just think outside of the box, but we can use money Legos. So basically, there's all these open standards and open source software repositories where basically I can assemble the money Legos together and not even have to build the software myself in order to build a new economic system. And that's what makes me almost sure that blockchain systems are going to beat the old financial system. Is like, you've got all these money Legos, like you've got like ETH, and then you've got ERC20 tokens, and then you've got DAI, which is a stable coin, and then you've got CDAI, and then you've got quadratic funding and AMMs. And the result is that like 22-year-olds can walk into a hackathon and build in a weekend something that would have taken a bank $10 million and a staff of 1,000 to do 20 years ago. Like, to me, that's deeply cool. And so the progress is exponential in this space, and it all goes back to open source software. I'm such an open source maxi because of those money Legos. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what's deeply cool, is that we're actually in a position to be working on this stuff and to be building these things, whereas 20 years ago I don't think that it would have been possible.
It's the mission of Gitcoin, right? Is open source software, and that ethos is definitely coming through. Maybe it's the solar punk ethos. Is that right?
Yeah, it might actually be worth touching on that. So a lot of early blockchain philosophy is very libertarian. It's very much about sovereignty and individual rights. And then it's also about privacy. If you ever read the Cypherpunk Manifesto and the Cyberpunk Manifesto, there's a lot in there about sovereignty and privacy. So basically shielding your actions from surveillance, not only from the state, but surveillance capitalism. And I think that the cypherpunks got a lot right. And I think that there's a lot to be said about the sovereignty of our rights in the digital world. Just the fact that, like, when I upload a photo to Facebook, I'm like a serf on Zuckerberg's kingdom, and I don't have any rights to that photo if they decide to take it down because they decided to. But like with NFTs, I actually have property rights in the metaverse. And I think there's a lot to that cypherpunk philosophy of we should actually have property rights, we should have sovereignty, and we should have privacy. But I think that there's an adjacent value system that is called solarpunk, which is about solving our contemporary problems with sustainability and how we coordinate with each other. And I think that the combination of the cypherpunks and the solarpunks could yield a lot better systems for humanity, because I think we need to like actually solve the problems. Like I worry a lot about climate change. Like there's just no way to say it another way. And envisioning this world in which we've solved our problems with sustainability, figured out how to live in harmony with each other and with the earth, I think is that's something we could build for with these systems as well. Looks like you found some solar punk art on your Google images right here.
Yeah, I love going through the solar punk vibes just to give some color to kind of the context of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And then there's actually been, in the last like couple months, there's been a backlash against solar punk. People saying that solar punks are too naive. Like, what if we build these monetary systems and the government's like clamping down on crypto? Then the solar punk part of crypto has to go away, or basically gets charged with like some sort of crime or something like that. And so there was a combination of cypherpunk and solar punk ethos called lunar punk, which is basically the same sort of solar punk ethos around solving for sustainability, but with deep privacy in it. So basically, like, what is the solar punk vibe of solving for sustainability look like when you deeply embed privacy at each individual level? And there was a really great essay about lunar punk that recently came out. I'm going to try to find a link to it so that I can show it off here. But I think that it's neat that like we've now entered into this dance between cypherpunk and solarpunk about what kind of world we want to do, and they're kind of like riffing on top of each other.
It is an interesting kind of philosophical debate, right? Like, in order to have a regenerative economy, do we need to rely on altruism from all the participants. Like, are there ways to structure maybe like a maybe, I don't know, a more capitalist kind of incentivized structure to create this sort of economy where, we can all agree that climate change is a thing and we need to do something about it, but then actually be incentivized to kind of, I don't know, purchase carbon credits or, take some other action.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the billion-dollar question?
That's why we all need to be ideating on this and getting Gitcoin grants.
Yeah, totally. I don't have an answer, but I have some sort of thoughts that I've started putting together about that, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity in combining the individualist incentive, like, so basically, like, individualists, like people on the right end of the spectrum, or like libertarians, are all about sovereignty. They think taxation is theft, and they think that basically taxation is theft. And there's a spectrum that's more collectivist, which is more associated with the left here in the United States, that, well, we have to solve for our contemporary coordination problems. We need taxes. And it's like a consequentialist take, where it's like, we need taxes in order to fund our roads and bridges, in order to solve our coordination failures, like climate change and national defense is like a coordination, like where a lot of our tax money goes. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity if you could fund solving the world's coordination problems without taxes, then I think you unite a lot of people on the left and the right with insofar as, like, you can solve the collectivist problems, but without basically violating people's sovereignty by taxing them. And so I think that, there are some valid criticisms that, like, governments are basically horribly bureaucratic and inefficient and opaque, and how much of our tax dollars do they waste? When you pay taxes, you don't actually get a chance to vote on, like, okay, I want you to fix the potholes in my town, but I don't want you to fund the war in the Middle East or something like that. And so, I think that there's an opportunity to build an opt-in, regenerative, pluralistic, crypto regenerative coordination failure solving system, coordination ecosystem, and basically prove that we can do it without taxes. And I think that that's kind of like what solving for open source sustainability is. And if we can solve that, then I think that there's a lot of a case that we can unite those two sides of the spectrum. But man, the stakes are really fucking high. One of the things that really kind of bugs me right now is that I really worry about climate change a lot, and that's a global coordination problem. And all we have in, like, our substrate for solving coordination problems being the government means that we're only concerned about our own national welfare and not the global welfare. So we need a global coordination mechanism to solve this global coordination failure. And so what are the global coordination failures out there? There's like journalism and misinformation in our global information networks. There's digital infrastructure, there's climate change. So we should try to start solving these global coordination failures with Ethereum, which is the global coordination substrate for the world. So yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, but those are a lot of thoughts that I've put together on the subject. I feel like we're straying though. We're straying a little bit from open source sustainability, but it's fine because I think these are very existential problems.
Just a question on kind of where we are in sort of crypto today. I think we were talking about this a little bit kind of before we started, Kevin, but prices are kind of falling down, and this Terra implosion is pretty insane. It's wiped out over 50 billion in market value. A lot of us are newbies in the crypto economy and ecosystem. Personally, I joined in kind of early 2021 and haven't really seen a cycle yet. So as a wise crypto veteran, what thoughts do you have or advice kind of for our audience members and how to survive crypto cycles?
Yeah, well, I'm a software engineer and not a strong finance person, so take what I say with a grain
Sorry
of
for
salt.
the unfair question.
But I am a grizzled veteran of crypto, in that I've survived for 5 years in a very volatile ecosystem. Prices go up, prices go down, and I think that we oscillate between fear and greed in this like big super cycle that up until now has been oriented around the Bitcoin halving. And I believe that you shouldn't invest more than you can afford to lose. And that's an important thing, because when you get wiped out, you like, survival is the name of the game. And that's hard to do when you see 300 like 30% gains day over day. You're like, oh shit, I should put more money into this. And it's very tempting to put in more money into the crypto ecosystem. But I advocate just putting in a couple, like $100 of play money. If $100 is play money to you, then put in $100. If $1 is play money, then put in $1 into the market, just enough so that you have skin in the game and you can start following it and go through a market cycle. And I just focus on the tech. I like focusing on what Vitalik Buterin is focused on, which is basically what is the frontier of the technological primitives that are going to be released into the market. And I think that you can kind of front run where the market is going by just understanding the technology. Again, I'm very privileged though. I've got a computer science degree and I understand a lot of the technology. And so I just try to focus on the technology, and I let the market cycles ride. And I think that over the long term, crypto has been appreciating a lot thus far. And so if you can hold on and survive for the long term, then you're going to do okay. So yeah, I mean, that's my very limited perspective, but I think crypto is not for everyone. I think that if you can handle the volatility, both financially and emotionally, then it's worth playing in, but it's definitely not for everyone. I like the analogy that Bankless uses. They talk about crypto as like going west, kind of like, like a couple hundred years ago in the United States, where you're on the Western frontier and you couldn't rely on infrastructure and you kind of had to fend for yourselves. I think there's a lot of nice analogies with that vis-a-vis crypto, because a lot of the infrastructure that you would rely on in a city is not available out west. A lot of infrastructure that you could rely on in the old financial system is not available in the crypto ecosystem. So it's up to everyone's risk appetite, I think.
Yeah, it's very much the frontier and risky, and don't put in more than you'd be willing to lose. I think that's the kind of common advice.
Yeah, totally.
And that sort of thread of our idea of going west sort of really resonates. And you're a Colorodian, Kevin, and I think you live in Boulder and always have a lot of really good things to say about Boulder. I live in San Francisco, and a lot of our community here is in the Bay Area. How do you think living in kind of an area where there's a lot of nature and kind of outdoor stuff, inspires or affects you, or
yeah. Well, I definitely moved out to Colorado thinking I was going to get more time outdoors, but instead I'm just working a lot. So I don't know, maybe I'm not the right person to ask, but
we're huddled around our computers 24/7.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think nature grounds me, and it's that replenishment of the spirit that I think that really matters. It's not financial capital. It's a form of utility, like Soma, that's not financial capital. And so if the market's taking a shit or Gitcoin's having a bad day or week, just going outside and being in the fresh air and sunshine, it's just hard to be unhappy with that. So I'm a big believer in communing with nature in every chance that you get. So I don't think it's a fully formed like philosophy or anything like that, but I just love Colorado, and I moved out here from New York City so that I could be around more nature day over day. So it's been very cool to be out here. And what's neat about Web3 is that you can do it from anywhere. You don't need to be in New York or Silicon Valley to have a career. And I think that's a very special thing. You can do it with an internet connection from anywhere.
Yeah, the future is global and distributed.
Yep.
We have a question from Graham. Is Gitcoin more engineer oriented? Can I get involved as a front end developer?
Yep, definitely. We definitely started off with open source sustainability, but we've expanded into a lot of different public goods. I'd say any type of knowledge worker can use Gitcoin. Software development, whether you're protocol developer, backend developer, front end developer, or designer, or a copywriter, or just a thinker and entrepreneur. There's lots of ways to contribute to the public good in Web3. So we definitely started with our ethos as developers, but have been trying to be more inclusive of other types of knowledge workers recently.
That's great. Well, I think we're nearing towards the top of the hour here, so might want to wrap up. And Kevin, we're just really appreciative of you coming and chatting, getting off topic and having a really interesting discussion. I think our audience has really appreciated it. In the last kind of couple of minutes here, is there anything you want to plug or, tell the audience, and how can they connect with you?
Yeah. So my Twitter is twitter.com/Owocki. I'll just put that into the Zoom chat. I'm most active there. People have feedback on what we discussed, then please send me a tweet. And thank you again for having me.